Aegon the Conqueror. Aegon Targaryen is the guy who started it all, but he didn't just conquer the map. He basically broke the world and rebuilt it in his own image. Before Aegon, Westeros was a mess of 7 different kings who couldn't stop stabbing each other in the back. Aegon showed up and told them the party was over. He did it with the 3 biggest dragons the world had ever seen. If you want to know how serious he was, just look at Harrenhal. The king there thought he was safe behind the thickest stone walls ever built. Aegon just flew over them and turned the entire castle into a giant oven. He cooked a king in his own home just to send a message. Stone doesn't matter when you have dragons. But Aegon wasn't just some mindless butcher. Once the fighting stopped, he actually tried to make the place run. He started the small council, built a capital city out of mud and wood, and forged a throne out of the melted swords of the people he beat. That's the Iron Throne. It's not supposed to be comfortable. It's supposed to be a reminder that if you're sitting there, you're never truly safe. Aenys the Unworthy. So Aegon dies, and the throne goes to his son, Aenys. If Aegon was a god, Aenys was just a guy. He was soft, he was sickly, and he spent way too much time trying to make everyone like him. The problem is, when you rule a kingdom built on fire and blood, being nice looks a lot like being weak. The moment he took the crown, the High Sparrow and the Lords of Westeros smelled blood in the water. They rebelled almost immediately. Aenys couldn't make a decision to save his life, literally. He spent 5 years stressed out and shivering until his heart finally gave out. He's the guy who proved that just because you have a Targaryen name doesn't mean you're fit to sit in the chair. Maegor the Cruel. While Aenys was busy being soft, his half-brother Maegor was waiting in the wings. Maegor was the family's muscle, a massive, terrifying warrior who rode Balerion the Black Dread. When Aenys died, Maegor didn't wait for a coronation. He just grabbed the crown and dared anyone to stop him. He was a man who solved every problem with a sword or dragonfire, earning his cruel nickname by spending his entire reign hunting down anyone who questioned his right to rule. His biggest claim to fame is finishing the Red Keep. After the secret tunnels were finished, he threw a feast for all the builders and then slaughtered every last one of them, so the castle's secrets died with them. He saved the Targaryen dynasty through pure, unadulterated violence, but he died alone on the Iron Throne, literally stabbed by the chair he fought so hard to keep. Jaehaerys the Conciliator. After Maegor died, the throne went to his nephew, Jaehaerys. Jaehaerys was the dream. He inherited a kingdom that was basically a dumpster fire. The lords were angry, the church was in revolt, and the treasury was a mess. But instead of burning everyone, Jaehaerys actually sat down and talked. He earned the name the Conciliator because he was the ultimate diplomat, fixing the broken laws and making peace with the faith without losing his head. He didn't just talk though, he built. He's the guy responsible for the King's Road, the massive highway that connects the whole continent. He knew that if people could trade and travel, they'd be too busy making money to start a war. He ruled for 55 years, which is the longest reign in history, and he did it alongside his wife, Queen Alysanne. They were the ultimate power couple, flying their dragons to every corner of Westeros to hear what the common people actually needed. But even the old king had a tragic side. Despite fixing the entire country, he couldn't fix his own family. He had 13 children, and watching them die, rebel, or fail to live up to his legacy slowly broke him. By the time he died, he was a lonely old man who had outlived almost everyone he loved. He left the kingdom at its absolute peak. Viserys I. Viserys was the son of a king, but he was no warrior. He just wanted to build pretty models of old Valyria and keep his family from tearing each other apart. He inherited a golden age from his grandfather Jaehaerys, and his only goal was to keep that peace going. His biggest problem? He didn't have a son to inherit the throne, so he named his daughter Rhaenyra as his heir. Then, against all odds, he got a son with his second wife, Alicent Hightower. Viserys spent the rest of his reign desperately trying to force his family to get along, refusing to believe they'd actually go to war. He just wanted everyone to hug it out. He died a slow, painful death in his bed, frail and broken, still clinging to the hope that his family would honor his wishes. Aegon II, or Aegon the Usurper, is the king who never should have been. He spent his youth drinking and avoiding responsibility, but when his father Viserys died, his family shoved him onto the throne to keep his sister Rhaenyra from taking it. He's the face of the Greens, and his reign was basically one long, bloody disaster called the Dance of the Dragons. He was a survivor. He was burned, his dragon's sunfire was crippled, and he spent most of the war in hiding or in agony. He eventually managed to outlive Rhaenyra, even feeding her to his dragon while her son watched. But his victory was hollow. He was a broken man ruling a broken kingdom. He only lasted 2 years before his own advisors decided he was more of a liability than a leader. They ended his reign the quick way, a cup of poisoned wine. Rhaenyra I. Before we get to Aegon III, we have to talk about the woman history tried to delete, Rhaenyra Targaryen. She was her father's chosen heir, the realm's delight, and for a brief, bloody 6 months, she actually held King's Landing and sat on the Iron Throne. She did the work. She held court, she signed decrees, and she wore the crown. But the city she won was starving and broken, and the people eventually turned on her, forcing her to flee the very seat she fought a civil war to claim. The reason she isn't officially Queen number 6 on most lists is because the men who won the war wrote the history books. They labeled her a usurper and decreed that her half-brother, Aegon II, was the true king all along. Even when her own son eventually took the throne, he didn't officially recognize her reign just to keep the peace. She's the queen who lost everything. Aegon III. This Aegon is probably the most depressed guy to ever sit on the throne. If you think your childhood was rough, this kid had to watch his own mother get eaten by a dragon while his uncle Aegon II stood there and watched. By the time he actually became king at 11 years old, he was completely checked out. He didn't want to feast, he didn't want to hunt, and he definitely didn't want anything to do with dragons. In fact, he's known as Dragonbane because the very last Targaryen dragon died during his reign. Some people think he actually poisoned them because he hated the creatures that killed his family, but the reality is more technical. The dragons were just getting smaller and weaker until they eventually went extinct. He ruled for 26 years, but he was basically a ghost in his own castle, but he never smiled once. He's the king who proved that winning the war doesn't mean you get a happy ending. Daeron I. Daeron was the eldest son of Aegon III, but he was nothing like his gloomy, dragon-hating father. While Aegon III spent his reign mourning the past, 14-year-old Daeron was obsessed with glory. He was tired of hearing that the Targaryens were weak now that their dragons were extinct. To prove the world wrong, he decided to finish what even the Conqueror couldn't. He was going to take Dorne. Against all advice, this teenager led a massive army into the desert. Through brilliant mountain tactics, he actually pulled it off, becoming the first king to truly unite Westeros from top to bottom. He even wrote a famous book about his victory. But Daeron learned the hard way that the Dornish don't stay conquered. During a rebellion, he was lured into a peace talk and met his end under a flag of truce. He died at 18. Baelor blessed. Baelor was the younger brother of Daeron, and he was the most religious man to ever wear the crown. While his brother loved war, Baelor loved the gods. His first act as king was to walk barefoot into the deserts of Dorne to make peace, and legend says he even walked through a pit of venomous vipers and survived because his faith was so strong. He built the massive Great Sept in King's Landing, but he also locked his own sisters away in a maiden vault for years because he thought looking at them was a sin. He spent his final days fasting for 40 days straight to cleanse the kingdom, which eventually caused his body to fail. Some people think he was a saint, while others, including his own hand, thought he had completely lost his mind. Viserys II. Viserys II is the unsung hero of the Targaryen dynasty. He was the younger brother of Aegon III and spent decades serving as the hand of the king for his brother and both of his nephews, Daeron and Baelor. While they were busy chasing glory in the desert or praying in the Sept, Viserys was the one actually running the country, fixing the economy, and keeping the government from collapsing. When he finally became king in his own right, people expected a new golden age because he was so experienced. But his reign reign lasted less than a year. He met a sudden end, and many suspect his own son, Aegon the Unworthy, sped up the process with a bit of poison to get to the crown faster. Aegon IV, the Unworthy. If you thought Maegor the Cruel was bad, meet Aegon IV, the man history officially remembers as the Unworthy. He didn't just ruin the kingdom, he did it on purpose, with a smile on his face. Once he had the crown, he treated the Seven Kingdoms like his own personal playground. Aegon was a man of pure excess. He was corrupt, gluttonous, and obsessed with his own desires. He famously said he tried to sleep with every woman in the realm, and he practically did, fathering dozens of bastards. He gave away royal treasures to his favorites, and executed people on a whim just to seize their lands. He was so disliked that even his own brother, the legendary Aemon the Dragon Knight, died defending him from an assassination attempt. Not because he loved Aegon, but because he was bound by his oath. But his most unworthy act happened on his deathbed. Instead of trying to keep the peace, he decided to throw a match into a powder keg. In his final will, he legitimized all of his bastard children. This single act of spite created a massive line of rival heirs, leading directly to the Blackfyre Rebellions, a series of civil wars that would haunt the Targaryens for generations. He died as a massive, bloated man who left the realm on the brink of total collapse just because he could. Daeron II. This guy had the hardest job in history, cleaning up the absolute disaster his father, Aegon the Unworthy, left behind. Daeron was the complete opposite of his dad. He was scholarly, kind, and fair, which is why history calls him the Good. His biggest achievement was finally bringing Dorne into the Seven Kingdoms, not through war, but through marriage and diplomacy. He did what the Conqueror and the Young Dragon never could. He actually united all of Westeros. But being a good king didn't make his life easy. Because his father had legitimized all those bastards, Daeron's claim was challenged by his half-brother, Daemon Blackfyre. Daemon was everything the people wanted in a king. He was a warrior, he was handsome, and he carried the family's Valyrian steel sword. This sparked the First Blackfyre Rebellion, a massive civil war that pitted brother against brother. Daeron eventually won, but he spent his entire reign fighting to prove he was the rightful heir. He transformed the Red Keep from a den of corruption into a place of law and culture. He was a great man who ruled during an impossible time, eventually meeting his end during a great spring sickness that swept through the city. Aerys I was the kind of king who would have been much happier as a librarian. He was second son of Daeron II. He inherited the throne during a time of chaos, droughts, Ironborn raids, and lingering Blackfyre threats. But he didn't seem to care about any of it. He was obsessed with books, ancient prophecies. He famously never had children because he simply wasn't interested in his wife, preferring the company of his library. He left the actual ruling to his uncle, Bloodraven, a sorcerer-like figure who turned the kingdom into a police state. Aerys was a passive king who let the realm drift while he searched for secrets in the past. Maekar I. Maekar was the fourth son of Daeron II and the younger brother of the bookish Aerys I. He spent his whole life feeling overlooked and grumpy because his older brothers got all the glory. He's most famous for accidentally killing his brother Baelor in a trial by combat, a tragedy that haunted him forever. When he finally became king, he was a stern, hard-working soldier who didn't care about being liked. He died in battle, crushed by a giant rock thrown from the walls of a rebellious lord's castle. Aegon V, or Egg, is probably the most human king to ever wear the crown. He spent his youth traveling the Seven Kingdoms as a squire named Egg, hiding his royal identity and sleeping under the stars with a hedge knight, Sir Duncan the Tall. Because he was the fourth son of a fourth son, nobody ever expected him to rule, hence the nickname the Unlikely. When he finally took the throne, he was a king of the people. Because he had lived among the small folk, he spent his entire reign trying to pass laws that protected the poor and limited the power of the lords. Naturally, the High Lords hated him for it. His life was a constant struggle to do the right thing in a system that didn't want to change. His story ends in tragedy at Summerhall. Obsessed with bringing back dragons to force the lords to obey his reforms, he attempted a ritual that went horribly wrong. A massive fire broke out, destroying the palace and taking Aegon's life along with his oldest friend, Sir Duncan. Jaehaerys II was the second son of Aegon V. He was physically weak and sickly, but he was incredibly sharp. His short 3-year reign was defined by the War of the Nine Penny Kings, where he finally ended the Blackfyre threat for good. He died young due to his failing health. Aerys II, or Aerys the Mad King, is the most infamous name in the entire Targaryen line. He didn't start out as a monster, though. In his early years, he was charming, ambitious, and full of big plans. But as the years went by, his mind began to fracture. The turning point was the defiance of Duskendale, where he was kidnapped and held prisoner for months. When he was finally rescued, he emerged a completely different man, paranoid, delusional, and terrified of being touched. His paranoia turned into a literal obsession with fire. He became fascinated by wildfire, using it to execute anyone he suspected of plotting against him, including Lord Rickard Stark. He saw enemies in every shadow, eventually turning on his own Hand of the King, Tywin Lannister, out of pure jealousy. As his madness peaked, he stopped grooming himself, growing long, jagged fingernails and tangled hair, looking more like a monster than a monarch. The breaking point for the realm came when his son Rhaegar allegedly kidnapped Lyanna Stark, sparking Robert's rebellion. As the rebel armies closed in on King's Landing, Aerys didn't try to surrender or escape. Instead, he ordered his pyromancers to hide jars of wildfire under the entire city, planning to burn 500,000 people alive rather than lose his crown. He was famously stopped by his own Kingsguard, Jaime Lannister, who ended Aerys's life to save the city. His death marked the end of nearly 300 years of Targaryen rule. Robert Baratheon. He wasn't just a random rebel who decided to grab the crown. He was actually a cousin to the family he overthrew. His grandmother was Rhaelle Targaryen, which gave him the strongest legal claim to the throne once the Mad King's immediate heirs were gone. He was a mountain of a man, a peerless warrior who smashed the Targaryen dynasty to pieces with his warhammer at the Battle of the Trident. But as the old saying goes, winning a kingdom and ruling one are two very different things. Once he put on the crown, the demon of the Trident turned into a bored, heavy-drinking monarch who hated every second of his job. Robert despised meetings, coins, and the whispers of court life. He spent his 17-year reign hunting, feasting, and fathering bastards while running the kingdom into massive debt. He left the actual governing to his hand, Jon Arryn, while he lived in a cloud of wine and regret for the woman he lost, Lyanna Stark. His life ended not on a battlefield, but in the woods, taken out by a wild boar during a drunken hunt. His death triggered the War of the Five Kings. Joffrey Baratheon. Joffrey is the king everyone loved to hate. Though he carried the Baratheon name, he was actually the product of the secret relationship between Cersei and Jaime Lannister. He was a spoiled, cruel, and cowardly boy who mistook ruling for bullying. From the moment he ignored everyone's advice and ordered the execution of Ned Stark, he proved he was too unstable and impulsive to lead. His short reign was defined by the chaos of the War of the Five Kings. He took pleasure in tormenting Sansa Stark and treated his subjects with total contempt. He thought the crown made him untouchable, but his arrogance was his downfall. He met a legendary end at his own wedding feast, gasping for air after being poisoned in front of the entire court. Cersei Lannister. After the loss of all 3 of her children, Cersei stopped playing by the rules entirely. She didn't wait for a council to choose a successor. She seized the throne for herself by force. She was the first woman to officially rule from the Iron Throne, and her coronation was paved with the ashes of her enemies. Cersei's reign was defined by cold, calculating survival. She was surrounded by enemies on all sides, the Starks in the north, the Targaryen invasion from the east, and a rebellion within her own city. She was a ruler who chose to be feared rather than loved, famously saying, "I choose violence." But no amount of wildfire could stop the inevitable. Her reign ended when the dragons finally arrived, and the Red Keep collapsed around her. The Ghost Kings. While the crown officially belonged to the 21 monarchs we've covered, the physical Iron Throne was sat upon by several others who never held the title of king. In the world of Westeros, sitting the throne is a symbol of absolute authority, often used by the hand of the king to dispense justice when the monarch is away. The most famous example example, is Ned Stark, who sat the throne to strip Sir Gregor Clegane of his lands and titles while Robert Baratheon was off hunting. We also saw Tywin Lannister command the room from those jagged blades while serving as hand for his grandsons. Perhaps the most iconic moment, however, belonged to Jaime Lannister. After plunging his sword into the Mad King, Jaime didn't flee. He climbed the steps and sat on the throne, waiting in silence to see who would come to claim the ruins of an empire. Sitting the throne didn't make them kings, but for a brief moment, it gave them the power of gods.